How in the world does a small nation, mostly made up of peasant farmers, manage to defeat the most powerful military superpower on the planet? You really have to ask. Well, this story isn't just about one war. It's about a much bigger, global struggle, a clash of ideas that set up a classic David versus Goliath showdown deep in the jungles of Southeast Asia.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. We're going to start with the big picture, a world literally split in two. Then we'll zoom right in on Vietnam and figure out why it became such a critical flashpoint. From there, we'll get into the wildly different ways each side fought this war, how it all started to come apart for the United States, and finally, what it all meant for the Cold War.
Okay, first things first, let's set the stage. Picture it. The year is 1945. World War II has just ended. The old European empires, they're basically in shambles, and this creates a huge power vacuum. And stepping into that void are two very, very different superpowers, which sets the scene for a brand new kind of conflict.
So the world basically split right down the middle. On one side, you've got the United States and its allies who are all about capitalism, private ownership, and democracy. And on the other side, you have the Soviet Union and its partners, pushing a system of state ownership and a totalitarian one-party government. And look, these weren't just slightly different economic policies. We're talking about two fundamentally opposing ways of looking at the entire world.
The first move in this giant global chess match was for each side to start grabbing territory. The Soviet Union set up a buffer zone of friendly communist countries in Eastern Europe to act as a shield. At the same time, the U.S. was using its economic and political muscle to lock down allies in the West. This whole process created what we now call spheres of influence.
So how did the U.S. respond? Well, they came up with a really clear and powerful strategy. And this is the key to understanding everything that comes next. It was called the policy of containment. The goal wasn't to go in and destroy communism where it already was. Nope. The plan was much simpler. Build a wall, politically and militarily, to stop it from spreading 1 inch further. And that one idea would drive American foreign policy for decades.
Okay, so we have this big, abstract foreign policy idea called containment. How does that lead to a real bloody war in the jungles of Southeast Asia? Well, this is where the high-minded theory slams into some very grim reality on the ground.
And that really is the central question, isn't it? What could possibly make a superpower send over 500,000 of its own people to fight and die in a small, faraway country that posed literally no direct threat to its own borders? The answer all came down to one incredibly persuasive idea: the domino theory. You see, American leaders genuinely believed that if South Vietnam fell to communism, it would trigger a chain reaction. They pictured Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, all of them, toppling one by one, just like a line of dominoes. And that would completely change the balance of power across the globe.
So now let's get into the nitty-gritty of the fighting itself, because this was not your typical war. It was a complete clash of styles. You had overwhelming high-tech military power on one side, and on the other, you had these unconventional people-powered tactics that basically rewrote the rulebook.
The American game plan was, pretty straightforward. Use overwhelming force. We're talking massive bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder, using chemical defoliants like Agent Orange to just dissolve the jungle, and sending troops on search and destroy missions. The whole idea was to leverage their technological superiority to just grind the enemy down.
But, and this is a huge but, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong just refused to play that game. They fought a people's war, which meant guerrilla tactics, hit and run, booby traps, sabotage. They had the incredible Ho Chi Minh Trail for supplies, they built these massive underground tunnel systems, and most importantly, they tapped into the powerful feeling of nationalism. For a lot of Vietnamese, this wasn't about communism versus capitalism. It was about kicking out another foreign invader, first the French, and now the Americans.
So you can really see this whole conflict play out in 3 distinct acts. Act 1, it starts as a local insurgency. Then, in Act 2, around 1965, the U.S. goes all in, turning it into a full-scale American war. And finally, Act 3, starting in '69, is the long, messy process of the U.S. trying to get out while handing the war over to the South Vietnamese.
That Viet Cong strategy of just frustrating and outlasting the Americans, well, it turned out to be incredibly effective. It led to a massive turning point in 1968 that even though it was a military failure for them, it became a spectacular political victory that absolutely shocked the American public and pretty much sealed the fate of the war.
That event was the Tet Offensive. So the Viet Cong launched these stunning surprise attacks on over 100 cities all at once. Now, militarily, they got crushed. They suffered huge losses. But back in the US, people watching the chaos unfold on their TVs saw something totally different. For years, they'd been told, "We're winning." And now they saw this. It proved the enemy could strike anywhere, at any time. All of a sudden, the war started to look completely unwinnable.
And you have to remember, by this point, there were over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. But that's not just a statistic. These were mostly young guys, draftees, with an average age of just 19, fighting this terrifying and confusing war in a totally alien environment. The human cost was just becoming immense.
So the war wasn't just being fought in the jungles anymore, it was tearing America apart right at home. The Tet Offensive was like pouring gasoline on the fire of an already growing anti-war movement. Protests erupted on college campuses, in major cities, and public support for the war just plummeted. So now, the U.S. desperately needed an exit strategy. President Nixon rolled out a new policy called Vietnamization. The idea was to slowly pull American troops out while pumping tons of money and equipment into the South Vietnamese army so they could fight the war themselves. It was really a way to get out of an unpopular war without having to admit you lost, a political move to save face.
But it just didn't work. Only 2 years after the last American combat troops left the country, North Vietnamese tanks rolled right into the capital city of Saigon. The war was over. Vietnam was finally united, but under communist rule. The very domino they fought so hard to keep from falling had fallen.
So what are we supposed to take away from all this? Let's zoom back out one last time. What did the outcome of this horrible proxy war actually mean for the bigger Cold War picture? And what were the lessons learned from those jungles?
I think the biggest lesson from Vietnam is this. It showed that the Cold War wasn't just about who had more tanks or better bombers. It was also a war of ideas, of nationalism, of sheer determination. And in this case, the fierce will of a small country fighting for its own unification proved to be stronger than all the technological might of a superpower trying to contain an ideology.
And that really leaves us with this final thought to chew on. We often think of the Cold War as this huge standoff between Moscow and Washington. But the story of Vietnam shows that the real, bloody, devastating battles of the Cold War were fought in places like this. So it really makes you wonder, were these conflicts just sideshows to the main event? Or were they the very places where the Cold War was actually won and lost?